Hi everybody, welcome back to 10% True. My next guest is Jim Rookie Robb. Jim's a retired two-star Admiral, flew the F-14 over 25 years and accumulated about 4,000 hours in the aeroplane. Also flew the F-16N and the F-18. Jim was the first pilot to go straight from pilot training into the F-14 and was also in the first F-14 class to attend the Top Gun school. He also went back in 1990 as the commander of the Top Gun school, and he has a wealth of experience and some great stories to tell. Jim's interview is split into two. This first part covering the early portions of his career. The second part to follow will cover the rest of his career. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please subscribe, hit the thumbs up button. Appreciate your support.
So I went through college with a ROTC scholarship, so I ended up graduating with a commission in the Navy, and then went to flight school soon after and spent quite a long time there. The 1972, we were having a sort of Vietnam wind down, as you know. So the pilot training rates in all of the services had been really high going into the late 60s and early 70s, and then all of a sudden the war started to kind of unwind. So my experience was one of going to flight school when there was a huge surplus of pilots in the training program, and a great dramatic fall off with the number of seats that were available in the fleet. So we spent a period of time going through the first part of training, and then right in the middle of that, they came through and gave half the people a pink slip to go home, and cut the training rate from 2,000 a year to 1,000, and that was all based on sort of a grade merit system, and trying to get the supply to match the demand signal, at that point. So it was really an honor for me. I ended up spending more time in the training command because of all of that churn and the number of people that were in the population, and the really inability to service that whole group. Went to got a master's degree while I was in flight training, which was unusual, but it was because there was an extra amount of time to do that. And then we had a transition of the training airplanes. So the A4, the T2 and the A4 was a follow-on trainer for the advanced. The F9J was the previous trainer, and it started having mechanical problems, so they stopped flying it. So there were no training aids for about 6 months while they transitioned all the advanced training from the F9 to the A4. So I actually went through flight training for the A4 with the instructor pilots that were in school at the same time, and we got to know each other pretty well, and it was a very comfortable environment at that point. So went through the advanced training, did well, and was lucky enough to graduate fairly high, to where there was a couple of sets of orders to the F-14 training squadron for new people coming out, and that was in '73. And went to Miramar to join sort of the initial fleet stand-up of the F-14. And there were 2 squadrons at the time that had been transitioned, and were all the previous cadres were just transitioned into the F-14. And then we were at Miramar with 11 airplanes. The whole flight line was full of F-4s. The early F-14 days were very difficult. The history, a little bit of it, was that the Navy and the Air Force had been pushed to find a common follow-on airplane, and the F-111 was sort of that target. So the Navy and the Air Force were both evaluating it for their tactical use. The F-111 was a swing wing fighter, and it technically could land on a ship. But there was a lot of consternation inside the Navy that that's not the airplane that they needed. So at a point in the late 60s, the decision was made by Navy officials that they were going to try and develop a new airplane, the F-14. It was pretty hard fought, and at the end of the war, the money's going down, but there was a great rush to try to field the F-14 before essentially everything was going to get canceled. So the airplane was designed, built, and put to task in a relatively short time frame. And and there's a lot of bad things that happened because of that, and I can go over that in some detail. But one of the largest fallouts was that there wasn't enough time to finish the new engine that was supposed to be part of the F-14 program. So they ended up taking an A7 engine, TF-40, and putting an afterburner on it and sort of kind of kludging together an interim solution, which ended up being a 20-year solution, and putting it into the F-14. There were a lot of other issues. So, but the primary one was that the engine just had a really, really rough start. So in the first cruise, we lost 2 airplanes due to fan blades separating from the hub and going through the fuel tanks. So this fan blade integrity and the whole dynamics of thermodynamics of engines and trying to put, a much bigger load on what it was a fairly old technology turned out to be a real problem set for us. So when I deployed in '74 for the first time, we were having massive inspections and reworks, and we're pulling engines out of airplanes all the time to where trying to get safety. They put shrouding around all the fan blades, armor plating, and trying to protect the airplane from the engine. And we also had a lot of problems with water intrusion, integrity of the actual airframe itself. And so there was a lot of bugs. So the first cruise I had was kind of a terrible, disaster, honestly. We had 24 airplanes on the ship and routinely had 1 or 2 to fly. And there were, it was all maintenance and all problems involved with a brand new airplane.
Was that a combat cruise? Did you go to Southeast Asia?
No, we went to the Mediterranean, and there was a combat against the airplane, actually. So we were trying to live through. There were just a lot of problems with water intrusion. We had spoilers coming up in flight, and the airplane itself was aerodynamically very efficient, as you know, especially with the wings out. And so one of the big problems we had around the ship was that the airplane was light, had no drop tanks, had almost nothing on the wings. So you were back on the idle stops trying to land aboard ship. And the spool up time for the big fan engine was several seconds. So if you got low underpowered, it was not pretty. So again, there was just a lot of things that went on over the years to try to improve the engine and to improve the flight control systems, try to solve a whole myriad of sort of maintenance actions like flaps locking out and things happening the way they shouldn't happen. Really remarkable change in the next 5-7 years as they improved the performance of the airplane internally. The other things that were significant in terms of the F-14 was all the upgrades over time. You imagine we started out with 19 different computers in the airplane, and they were all trying to interact with each other. It was one of the first computerized airplanes, but it was an analog base with all these computers sort of fighting each other. And as the technology got better electronically, we went from tape drives to hard drives to huge increases in memory, a lot of digital upgrades to the airplane that were really very easy to do and increase the electronic performance of the airplane dramatically. So that was all headed in a good direction. And so the second, third, fourth, fifth block of airplanes that were produced ended up being almost levels of effort better each time a new airplane came out. And eventually we did get a new set of engines, the F-110, which is a GE engine. It's in the F-16, it's in the F-15 as well. We started to retrofit airplanes with this airplane with engines like that. And the reliability of the engine was a whole lot better. The fuel controls, they had a substantial amount more thrust available than the TF-30, and so that was really a phase one and phase two of the airplane. The last airplanes that were built with 110 engines, all digital infrastructure, all new radars, very high end, ended up being really excellent airplanes. All the way from the beginning to the end. The early ones, we were fighting them, just almost fighting the airplanes to stay alive, and had to get very much involved in the maintenance of the airplanes to make sure that we had something to fly at all. So we were all pilots, were all part maintainers, and much less pilots like the Air Force. They have a maintenance squadron and a operational training squadron. We were really blended in trying to help to get the airplanes to fly, and then taking care of them almost all the time.
When you did get to fly then, were they operationally effective in the early days? I mean, it was a fleet defender. My understanding is that it was intended to be able to reach out, hit at any bombers that were maybe going to drop some nuclear missiles or bombs on the fleet. Could it do the job in the early days?
Yes, and it was built as a fleet air defense fighter. So if you think about that time of everyone's life, is the Cold War, and it's the Soviets against the United States. So the war at sea was very much long-range bombers coming out to try to drop cruise missiles against carrier air groups, and that was a big part of our life. Was extended range interception of Badger, Bear bombers that were coming out to intercede and really try to interfere with our operations. So there was a cat and mouse game going on continuously between the deployed forces and the Soviet forces, both ground, sea, and air. So the F-14 could carry the Phoenix missile system, which was an extended range, 110-mile range missile that had a very good active seeker head on it, and it would fly out to 110,000 feet and then essentially go very long range and then come down and find the target. The radar was very long range, 120-mile radar, because it had a big dish nose. And so as a fleet air defender, the airplane was extremely capable of reaching out. We would routinely go out 400 miles from the carrier and cap, and then intercept bombers that were at extreme ranges, and play the game with the Soviets about trying to find the ship, turning off all the electronics, trying to play cat and mouse with them, just to prove that we could be where we wanted to be, and that they couldn't necessarily target us when they wanted to. And so that's a lot of that was long missions, and sort of a mind game between us and the Russians. So,
if you talk to some RAF pilots who have done that kind of intercept over the North Sea here, they'll say that particularly back when things were cold, the relationship between us and the Soviets were cold, that those bombers were playing some sort of dirty tricks. Particularly at night, turning on lights, getting low, trying to drag them into the sea,
right,
disorientate them. Did you experience anything like that?
Yeah, all of that. They had one electronic Badger that came by, and it turned all its jamming on and started frying equipment in the airplane. I mean, that was probably as bad as I ever saw it. But they routinely, if they'd find the carrier, they'd want to fly around at low altitude for an extended period of time, and we always had someone on their wing, and they would try to scrape the end of the water. There was a serious confrontation between us and the Soviets in terms of point and counterpoint, trying to make sure that we got in their face. They would come out and harass us, and so I think it was just part of the overall strategy of confrontation. And that's when you'd get up next to these folks, they weren't necessarily unfriendly, pilot to pilot. It was more about the game that was being played. So I think it's it was an important part of our history, and it was serious business for the carrier force. And it was, in some cases, it was pretty serious business. And I've got a whole bunch of stories I could tell you about detachments that we did in Alaska chasing Bear bombers around. But that fleet air defense, getting on and off the ship and trying to keep the airplanes, improving the airplanes' reliability were big focuses in the early days.
The other thing that you had was a data link, is that correct?
We did.
With the E2 and amongst yourselves.
Right. So we had a data link. We had an eye in the sky, with us all the time. That was helpful. The two-man crew was useful. The backseat didn't have any flight controls in it, but the radar operator, pretty much ran the radar. The pilot did the closer in, sidewinder kind of things, and the air combat maneuvering, obviously. And you could run the radar from the front seat in the tactical mode. If you're doing dogfighting, run the radar up and down, and get links. And you could also work the sidewinder, seek your head. So that was a good combination, and I found it useful.
I was thinking, probably the Soviet approach would have been to have tried to rush the fleet with overwhelming numbers. I mean, that was always there.
Yes.
Sort of quantity has a quality of its own, I guess you would say. What did how were you going to approach that threat then? How many aeroplanes, how many Tomcats could you get off the deck?
Well, the Mediterranean environment is a little more constricted than the Pacific, for example. I'd say the first cruise I was on, we were operationally ineffective. There were so many problems with the weapons control functions on the airplane that we didn't even load any missiles. I mean, it was kind of that bad. We did have a gun, and the gun would work, but the whole it was an analog weapons control system, and it was very prone to kind of go off on its own and be difficult. So I'd say I would write off the first cruise in terms of an experience there. After that, we started to build up more and more the ability to launch more airplanes. And in the big fleet exercises, we could sustain 8 airplanes in the air almost continuously, during the hours that we were flying. And the tactic for the Russian or the Soviet thing was to try to fly far enough out from the ship and intercept the bombers at a range beyond that they could launch their missiles. So that if a bomber was carrying 2 or 3 or 4 weapons, that you would deal with the bomber, not with the missiles. I mean, that was the force multiplier, and so that we did cap at range, like I said, 400 miles, and we would, sustain that coverage. And then every bomber that came near the ship, it was visibly, it had a friend, had a Tomcat attached to it. And that's, all us telling them that, okay, we can get you at a range that you can't shoot at us, that we're here, and that in all weather and whatever conditions, and that, just trying to tell them, by our actions that we were there to stay and that we could defend ourselves.
One of the things that seems to be thematic when you talk to people going, young guys who have come out of the training pipeline who have gone to their first operational fighter, is that just being a wingman is a challenge in maybe that first year or two. Does going to sea, does doing that off of the boat, does doing it in a brand new aeroplane that has all these problems make that challenge that much greater?
Well, for me, in my first cruise, I didn't know any better. So it just was what it was, and it was challenging, especially at night. Today we have a heads-up display, which has very good graphics and is a lot of really good information. The early heads-up display in the F-14 would jitter. It would sort of vibrate. And so, we would turn it off. especially at night, because it was disruptive to your. So there was no automatic carrier landing system. We didn't really even have like an ILS or something that was showed you the glide slope. It was pretty much all visual. A lot of scary performance at the back of the boat with early F-14, and we lost a substantial number of airplanes. Some to mechanical failure, some to engine failure, some to other systems that, hydraulics, all this stuff that would. So I think in the whole history of the F-14, we probably built about 420, and 110 or so were lost, to some sort of accident or failure. So it was a challenge, and as a young person, you have a sort of this invincibility. It's not going to happen to me. So it was a challenge, in that you knew the airplane. You just got to know it really well. You tried to deal with it on its own terms, and then have it, understand what it was going through, and then learn to deal with all of its idiosyncrasies. So we had a lot of circuit breakers that we would have to change, reset in the computers. It's just something you just learn how to do it. And it was more than should have been true. So I think that as I transitioned to better and better F-14s, in the 25 years that I was flying them, the eye opener for me was when I went to Top Gun as actually the CO, the commanding officer, in 1990. It was my first exposure to an F-16, and our F-16s were brand new. We killed them, but with fatigue life. But it was the first time I ever got in an airplane and everything worked. And I flew it, came back, everything worked. And I never got in an F-16 that I didn't take off, which was remarkable for an F-14 experienced person, because for most of my life on the carrier, if we wanted to launch two airplanes, we had to have a third and spare. So a running spare on the flight deck, because routinely one of the two would have a failure between the time it started up and it got to the catapult. So the pilot's life was fly two and then have to man a spare every day. And so you had this extra third of your life, which was taken up by essentially reliability issues. F-16s, I never spared. We never spared anything. At Top Gun, we had 6 of them. We flew 6 3 times a day, and that was a whole new experience for me. That how surprised I was that, wow, this really works, and we need to put reliability at the top of the list on the next round here, because it's not only a safety issue, it's just a huge issue with releasing the air crews to go do the operational task, right? So if you can go off and think about tactics, think about how much time you spent doing maintenance rather than tactics. And as we progressed in the Navy, and through the fighter weapons school business, and tried to sort of bring the flying cadre more and more into the tactical realm, I think we had great improvements.
You mentioned some interesting moments landing on the boat at night, and you explained that getting to know the aeroplane was sort of paramount in sort of overcoming those challenges. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to land in the daytime and what the differences then are? Obviously it's dark, but what the differences are between doing that in the day and then at night?
So there are some obvious ones. I would say in the daytime, you can see the horizon. You can, kind of virtually where you are above, around the ship. The challenges of a day landing on an aircraft carrier really involve the day pattern, because you come into a pitch or a break and you feed yourself into a downwind, and then you have to make a 180 degree turn to get on to final at the back of the boat. So you're constantly flying in a turn and getting yourself hopefully lined up with the ship as you come out of that turn, having the right amount of power, and so that when you go wings level, that you only have 15 or 18 seconds before you land. So there's not a lot of room for error at the start in a day pattern, just because of the fact that you're changing your attitude in a bank and the whole thing, and your power settings. So if you get a good start in the daytime, that's fine. A lot of failure in the day pattern are all associated with bad pattern behavior. Getting a bad start. At night, you lose all these visual cues, and so now you're flying an instrument approach, and that is today you would have a glide slope indicator. You'd have a lot of technology that helps you see where you should be on the glide slope, how to get better lined up with the ship itself, and then a lot of the flight controls are tuned to be much more reactive than they were in the old days. So without getting too technical, the F-14 is a big wing airplane, and occasionally it would get bent, and so at night flying straight ahead often meant you were in a slight angle bank, just because of the dynamics of the airplane. So you'd end up with learning tricks over time to always try to flatten the wings to the horizon at night, so that you're not constantly in a turn, without knowing about it, and so you just try to take away those variables. The other issues, the airplane had a lot of yaw movement, so that you were getting a sort of a weaving feel looking at the ship at night, and you didn't just have a lot of visual cues, so you were trying to fly your best radar altimeter approach, helped really by the backseater without any HUD, and then you also had a lot of issues with the ship moving around, obviously. So these things turn themselves into quite a challenge. And I'd say, so my whole F-14 career, we really were fairly basic airplane, without a lot of technology. And my son flew F-18s after I got out, and I used to ask him about what's it like. What do you think about flying at the back of the boat? And he said it's not a big deal. And the new technology on the HUD is that you have all these cues present, and if you put this thing called the tadpole on the ship, you're going to end up on the ship, and you have autopilot and a lot of really great features that are helping you speed stabilize the airplane, to the point where a lot of I'd say quite a high percentage of landings on the ship today are done automatically, where the pilot doesn't have any control over it. So that's a large. It took a lot of the safety out of it, both by fixing the airplane. With an engine quit and you came back single engine at night, boy, that was really not a good thing. I mean, if you came back with some some problem with spoilers, and just added to the challenge of trying to get aboard at night. But today, with today's technology, they've really taken a lot of that risk out. The reliability is much better. The visual cues are a whole lot better. You've got all this airliner kind of displays, to help you tell where you are on the back of the boat. They've also, just in the last 3 or 4 years, created a brand new system called Magic Carpet for the airplanes landing on the carriers today, and it's a combination of awareness by the airplane where the ship is, where it's going, and then a new flight control system. And it makes it an order of magnitude easier to land on the carrier. So that these things are getting better over time.
You mentioned earlier about running intercepts on the Soviets with everything turned off. That, I guess, is one of the the things that you would question about going into combat, whether or not these systems that rely on electronic emissions, whether they're going to be turned on, whether or not they'll still work in a jamming environment, whether or not the skills that are required to manually get back on the boat have atrophied because there's been a reliance on technology. Where's the balance?
Well, we did entire deployments without any radar. The ship turned off the tack ends, and they were very serious about maintaining integrity, of their electronic footprint. We did a lot of deceptive things where you would have carrier-like emissions from another ship, or you would do deceptive approaches, and so this was very much on their mind. I don't know today. There are a lot of systems that have been created that are GPS based, which allow you to find out where you are relative to the ship using GPS, relative GPS, which doesn't really use emissions from the platform itself. And so that helps. And then a lot of the new carrier landing approach systems that go from the ship to the airplane itself are low probability intercept signals, and so they've tried to maximize your opportunity to remain outside of maintain your electronic emissions, manage that. So ultimately, with today's satellite coverage and all of the systems going on, trying to hide from the enemy is much harder, just because of all the other sensors that are out there, heat sensors, satellites that they're watching motion, so the game evolves, and so it just has to be put into your tactics. In the old days, it was control your emissions and scare the hell out of yourself coming back to the boat. I flew a couple of missions in the Bering Sea where the Russians were trying to find us north of the Aleutian Islands, where I was shot off in the middle of the night in the middle of snowstorms with the ship was not going to turn on anything. And then we'd go up and chase the Soviets around and then have to find the ship. And you could use the radar to find, you had a place where you thought it was, going to be, then you just have to make your way back and find it. And, those were very challenging missions for sure.